Imagine walking through a museum of human evolution. On one side stands Australopithecus, small-brained, upright, and still carrying many ape-like features. Farther along comes Paranthropus, with enormous jaws and powerful chewing muscles. Then, behind a thick invisible line, begins Homo, supposedly the group that finally became recognizably human. For decades, that arrangement made sense. Australopithecus came first. Then Homo appeared. Brains grew. Tools became more sophisticated. Eventually, one branch led to us. But the fossils have stopped cooperating with that story. New discoveries keep placing supposedly primitive features inside Homo and supposedly human behaviors outside it. Species with small brains made surprisingly complex tools. Several very different human relatives lived at the same time. And fossils increasingly look less like neat steps on a ladder and more like pieces shuffled between different bodies. Now one researcher is proposing something radical. Perhaps the line separating Homo from our closest fossil relatives should be erased altogether. Under this proposal, species currently called Australopithecus and Paranthropus could be moved into the same genus as us. Homo, not because scientists suddenly think Lucy was basically a modern human, but because the categories themselves may no longer reflect the evolutionary tree we are discovering. To understand why, picture a family reunion 5 million years ago. There is no single line of ancestors marching toward Homo sapiens. Instead, several related populations occupy different regions of Africa. Some walk upright, some climb efficiently. Some have large teeth, others have smaller teeth. Their brains vary, their diets vary. Their skeletons combine traits in unexpected ways. Then populations split. Some disappear, some survive. Some may exchange genes. New branches appear. And millions of years later, paleontologists discover only fragments of them. A jaw here, several teeth there, half a skull, a few bones from a foot. Scientists must take those fragments and decide not only what species they belong to, but which genus should contain that species. That is harder than it sounds. A genus is the taxonomic level above species. Modern humans are Homo sapiens. Neanderthals are Homo neanderthalensis. Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and several other extinct species are traditionally included in the same genus. Australopithecus and Paranthropus are placed outside it. Historically, Homo was often associated with a familiar package of traits: relatively large brains, reduced teeth, more human-like bodies, and sophisticated tool use. That worked reasonably well when the fossil record was sparse. Then more fossils appeared, and the borders began to blur. Take brain size. If large brains are supposed to help define Homo, some members create an immediate problem. Homo floresiensis, the tiny human relative discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores, had a brain roughly comparable in volume to that of much earlier hominins. Homo naledi, discovered in South Africa, also had a surprisingly small brain. Yet both are classified as Homo. So a large brain can no longer be treated as a simple gatekeeper. Now consider behavior. Tool use was once imagined as another important threshold. The old picture went something like this. Australopithecus walked upright, but Homo became the toolmaker. The actual archaeological record is much messier. Stone tools appear near the time when multiple hominin groups existed, and researchers cannot always identify which species made them. Evidence for complex behavior is therefore increasingly difficult to assign exclusively to Homo. Paranthropus and Australopithecus cannot simply be dismissed as creatures living outside the behavioral world associated with early humans. Now imagine trying to sort 3 boxes of puzzle pieces. One box says Australopithecus. One says Paranthropus. One says Homo. At first, the pieces seem different enough. But with every new excavation, another piece arrives that fits 2 boxes at once. A small-brained Homo. An Australopithecus living surprisingly late. A Paranthropus with anatomical features overlapping other hominins. Eventually, the question changes. Maybe the puzzle pieces are not the problem. Maybe the boxes are. That is essentially the argument made by Ian Toll of Monash University in a 2026 paper in the American Journal of Biological Anthropology. Toll argues that human taxonomy has not fully kept pace with the way modern evolutionary biology classifies organisms. Today, biologists increasingly try to organize species into clades. A clade contains a common ancestor and all of its descendants. Think of cutting one branch from a tree. Everything growing from that branch belongs together. But some traditional hominin genera may not work that way. Australopithecus, in particular, is widely considered potentially non-monophyletic, meaning the species currently placed inside it may not form one clean evolutionary branch containing a common ancestor and all descendants. Some descendants traditionally assigned elsewhere may actually emerge from within that group. That creates a taxonomic headache. Imagine drawing Australopithecus as one branch. Then Homo emerges from somewhere inside it. If Homo descendants are removed and given an entirely different genus name, the original Australopithecus group may no longer represent a complete branch of the evolutionary tree. Toll's proposed solution is surprisingly simple. Make the branch larger. Instead of repeatedly trying to redraw narrow boundaries between Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and Homo, place the closely related hominins from roughly the last 4 to 5 million years into an expanded genus Homo. Lucy, for example, is currently Australopithecus afarensis. Under an expanded system, her genus name would change. Other Australopithecus species and Paranthropus species could also become members of Homo. That sounds almost absurd at first. A Paranthropus skull looks dramatically different from ours. Its face could be broad. Its jaws were enormous. Some species had huge molars adapted for powerful chewing. How can that possibly belong in the same genus as a modern human? But genera can contain enormous diversity. The question is not whether two members look identical. The question is whether the classification best represents their evolutionary relationships. And Toll argues that our own genus may currently be unusually narrow compared with many other primate genera. There is another reason the old categories are becoming uncomfortable. The fossil record increasingly shows evolution working as a mosaic. Traits do not all change together. Imagine building a character by choosing body parts from different stages of evolution. One species might have relatively human-like legs but a small brain. Another might have a face that looks primitive, but hands capable of sophisticated manipulation. Another could retain ancient shoulder anatomy while possessing more derived teeth. Evolution does not wait until every feature has been upgraded before creating a new population. Different parts of the body respond to different pressures at different speeds. That is why fossils often refuse to fit the neat packages scientists once used to define genera. The problem becomes even clearer when we travel to Ethiopia. At Ledi researchers have discovered evidence that Homo and Australopithecus were both present in the region around 2.6 million years ago. Homo fossils occur at about 2.78 and 2.59 million years ago, while Australopithecus appears at about 2.63 million years ago. These were not simply consecutive stages where one disappeared and the next replaced it. Different forms overlapped in time. Travel south to Drimolen in South Africa around 2 million years ago, and the scene becomes even stranger. Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and early Homo were all part of the evolutionary landscape around roughly the same broad period. Instead of a ladder, imagine a crowded savanna containing multiple versions of our extended family. Different bodies, different diets, different survival strategies. Some lineages vanish. One eventually leads to us. This is the picture modern paleoanthropology increasingly has to explain. But there is an important warning here. This new proposal has not suddenly rewritten every anthropology textbook. It is an argument made in a peer-reviewed paper for changing the way scientists classify hominins. Taxonomy contains judgment calls. Researchers can agree about the fossils and still disagree about where a genus boundary should be drawn. Another scientist might look at the same diversity and argue that keeping Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and Homo separate remains useful, because the groups represent meaningful anatomical or ecological differences. Changing the name on a fossil also does not change the fossil itself. Lucy would not become more human because the first word of her scientific name changed. Paranthropus would not suddenly lose its extraordinary jaws. The proposal is about the map, not the territory. But maps matter. The names scientists choose influence how students imagine evolution. And the familiar map has created a powerful illusion. Australopithecus, then Homo, then us. 3 increasingly human stages. Real evolution was almost certainly not that clean. Branches split. Traits appeared independently. Populations overlapped. Some characteristics evolved more than once. Others disappeared. and the species we recognize today may only represent a fraction of the diversity that once existed. That is why the debate is more interesting than simply renaming fossils. It challenges one of the deepest habits in how we think about ourselves. Humans like thresholds. The first toolmaker. The first large brain. The first member of Homo. The moment our ancestors became human. But nature rarely gives us a clean moment. Imagine watching sunrise one frame at a time. At midnight the sky is dark. At noon it is bright. But point to the single instant when night becomes day. There is no obvious border. Human evolution may be similar. Somewhere across millions of years, populations became progressively more like the humans alive today. But the transition was spread across anatomy, behavior, and ecology. There may never have been one trait that switched on and created Homo. That is precisely why every new fossil seems capable of disturbing the categories. We created sharp labels. Evolution created gradients. And now the fossils are exposing the difference. If Toll's proposal were eventually adopted broadly, museum labels would change. Textbooks would change. The familiar diagram of human evolution would look different. But the most important change would be conceptual. Australopithecus and Paranthropus would no longer sit outside our genus like preliminary experiments before the real humans arrived. They would become deeply divergent members of a much broader Homo lineage, a lineage containing tiny brains and huge brains, massive jaws and delicate faces, tree-climbing anatomy and long-distance walking, multiple strategies for surviving changing African landscapes. Most of those experiments failed. One lineage eventually produced us, and perhaps that is the lesson hidden underneath the naming debate. Human evolution did not march toward Homo sapiens. It explored possibilities. For millions of years, different relatives walked across the same planet, carrying different combinations of traits that we now divide into boxes. As the fossil record improves, those boxes are becoming harder to defend. Maybe the human family tree does not need another branch added. Maybe we need to redraw the boundaries around the branches we already have.